for us this Sunday. Our scripture lesson comes from the book of Colossians, chapter 3, verse 16. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. Teach and admonish one another in all wisdom, and with gratitude in your hearts sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs to God. And we're thankful for our reading and our hearing and our receiving of this God's holy word. Thanks be to God. Joy is the simplest form of gratitude. That was a phrase that I ran across this week as I was trying to think about what to put on our church sign. And it's a phrase that caught my attention because when I saw that phrase, joy is the simplest form of gratitude, it fits so perfectly with kind of the sermon topic for this week, which was the simple power of thank you, and talking a little bit about one of the people that I met in Spain that had a real impact on me and on others, a young lady named Teresa. For those that weren't here last week or hadn't seen the newsletter or might be new, throughout this month of July, I'm doing 5 sermons related to a pilgrimage that I took to Spain back in April. And last week, there were a lot of pictures of some of the sites we had visited. I don't have any of those this week because I just wanted to talk a little bit about this one person, Teresa, and all that she had meant to us and all the impact she had on us. Teresa is a young lady who was our guide for an afternoon as we went to tour the summer home of one of Spain's most famous poets and playwrights, a man named Gabriel Garcia Lorca. Teresa is an English teacher over there, but she has been to America for 1 year and taught Spanish at a high school in North Carolina. She's hoping to be able to come back with some sort of program and do that in East Texas this coming year. Don't know if that's going to work out. But her degree was in Spanish literature, so she came to tell us about this poet and playwright. But I can't tell you a whole lot about him other than he used to be regarded as unimportant and kind of vilified, and now other than Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote, he's considered maybe the greatest Spanish writer that they have had. What I do remember from the afternoon, though, is the time that we spent with this young lady. From the time that we first met her, we noticed that there was a gentleness and a kindness and a humility about her. She was very quiet, but had a wonderful smile and just a bright look in her eyes. And there was this kind of quiet energy, if you will, that kind of radiated from her, this joy about her that was evident. Even though it was in a very quiet, reserved sort of way. She wasn't normally a tour guide, and so she's not somebody that's generally used to being out front, who's not a loud or boisterous type of person. And yet there was this quality to her that many of us noticed right away. Before we went on the tour, we had lunch on our own, and there were about 10 of the 20 of us that had lunch together and met with Teresa. And we learned a little bit more about her story, about her growing up. She knew we were all pastors, and she was anxious to talk about her faith because she had grown up Catholic, but in that country, the Catholicism is not really practiced a whole lot. It used to be the state religion. They don't have a state religion anymore. But 70% of the population identifies themselves as Catholic, and that is overwhelmingly more than any other. There's a small percentage that classify Muslim and Jewish, and a small percentage that classify themselves as some sort of Protestant denomination, as well as about 20% who declare themselves atheist or agnostic. But out of that 70% of the population that identifies themselves as Catholic, only about 16% of those folks report any weekly church attendance. 56% say they attend a few times a year. But even among those numbers, even among those that are regular attenders, there's not much idea and thought going back throughout their history and even into present day, not much idea and thought about the emphasis on Bible studies and small groups and devotional time and spending that time in prayer. It's not as something that's thought of as being particularly important or practiced. As I thought about that in our own country, I had to say that I'm not sure that we practice those things as much as we pretend or claim that we do here. But we talk about the importance of it, and I hope that as we continue to talk about the importance of those times in private time and together time with God, that we recognize how important it really is. Well, not too many months ago, Teresa started attending a Protestant church, a new church that had started in that city of Granada. And because she knew we were pastors, she was eager to share with us what she was learning. We were there at the table getting ready to share a meal, and she was excited when we paused to have the blessing. That had been a new thing for her that had been introduced by these American missionaries that had come over. The way she described it as she was talking about it, she talked about how nice it was to be able to do that. And she said there that the pastor and his wife were, she said, teaching us to say thank you for the food. And this sort of thing that we were all pastors, we're getting ready to share a meal, so we're going to have a prayer, and who wants to do the blessing? And I'll tell you that a lot of times you get in a group of a bunch of preachers, we say blessings all the time, so usually we try to avoid it. We try to, we do a thumbs up, and whoever's last thumbs up has to say the blessing. Most of the time we're just ready to go ahead and do that. And yet she reminded us of how meaningful that should be. I don't know about for you, but for many times I'll say that when we do the blessing, it almost becomes a kind of perfunctory thing. And as the pastor, when people say, "Preacher, would you say the blessing for this?" Well, I'll be happy to do that. And yet here was something that we take for granted that I've done all of my life, and I can't tell you how many prayers over meals that I have offered. And being the preacher, one of the preachers in the family, I get called to do it at family gatherings as well. And yet it was something that meant so much to her. And it was such a new and powerful thing. And as we started looking at this through her eyes, we realized how strong and powerful that time ought to be, how special it ought to be to pause and say thank you to God for this wonderful meal, for the blessing of food. And on Grocery Bag Sunday, we can remember how thankful we ought to be. That we have that food, we have that abundance, because we remember that so many don't. She went on and talked about how for the first time in her life, she was reading the Bible. How she had her own Bible and she was studying it, and they were helping teach her about the Bible. And as she talked about that, and talked about what it meant to pray regularly and how powerful it was to have that daily prayer with God and spend that time listening to God. And as she talked about what it meant to her to have somebody pray for her, because she said that only rarely had she ever had somebody in a time know and pray specifically for her and call her by name. And as she talked about those things, you could see her face just light up. And her eyes were shining bright. And there was almost this glow on her face with all that she was learning and all that she was experiencing and how excited she was about her faith. When she was real young, she had been taught those basic doctrines of the church. And that was part of what they had to do before receiving their first communion. She had attended church somewhat sporadically, but she had never really been encouraged nor provided those opportunities to see what that daily living out of our faith can mean and how much it can mean to us and the impact it can make on others. She had never really explored for herself what it meant to be in that relationship with God through Jesus Christ and in the power of the Spirit. And I tell you, as we sat and we watched her, and as we listened to her, and as we saw the demeanor, and as we were with her throughout the rest of the day, we got excited all over again. And we talked later what a witness she was to us in that time and that place. We talked about how exciting it was to see somebody who had that passion for God, who was on fire for God, who had that joy that was just springing up out of her and everything that she did. That very core of her being, that sheer joy in her face and in her demeanor. And I couldn't help but wonder as I was thinking about that later, of how often do I show that, and how often do we in the church show and demonstrate that type of fire and that type of passion and that type of joy that is so evident and visible for other people to see. And one of the things I thought about was that maybe some of our greatest blessings are also some of our greatest challenges to faith. We are incredibly blessed, and we are reminded, in particular, having just celebrated Independence Day, of the tremendous blessing we have to worship as we choose or not to worship. How we can gather whenever we choose to gather. We don't have to report to anybody. Nobody tells us when or how we can worship or whether or not we can worship. Nobody tells us that we have to pray in a particular way or worship in a particular way. We don't face any sort of persecution, as we know that Christians do around the world. And I wonder if we don't have such freedom that we end up taking it for granted. Not that I want it to be taken away, but rather maybe we need to be reminded and we need to continually give thanks to God that we can gather whenever we choose and however we choose and with whom we choose to worship. We are a people of incredible and great abundance. And even with the economic troubles that we've had in our country the last few years, we are still a people of great abundance and great material blessings, far greater than any other country in the world. And I wonder sometimes if we're not tempted to place our trust in that abundance as opposed to the God who provides that abundance. Everywhere you go, you'll see a church, multiple churches. How many churches? I don't know exactly, but I bet within a 2-mile radius of our church, there are probably 10 or 12 at least different churches. There are about 6 or 7 I can call right off the top of my head, and I bet that there are more. There's Christian literature everywhere. People post religious things on Facebook, and there are websites. There are billboards that we see all over the place. There are channels on TV that are dedicated only to religious subject matter, and it ranges everywhere from Pentecostal to Catholic and every theological spectrum in between. There are other type of religious programming even on other channels. You can buy or download music and videos and books 24/7. I went into my office this week and I counted the number of different Bibles that I have in my office and the different translations. I have 13 Bibles in my office, hard copy Bibles in my office. I have a new Bible that I just downloaded, a new translation called the Common English Bible just came out. I didn't get a hard copy of it. I downloaded it to my tablet computer. And so I have it as it's as a Nook app on my computer. So that makes 14 that I have. I have 3 different Bible apps on my phone that provide daily devotionals or daily scripture readings. Via email, I get a daily devotional called Inward and Outward that has a little saying every day. Of those Bibles that I own, I have 8 different translations of the Old and New Testament. And while the number of Bibles and translations I have may be a little higher than normal because I'm a pastor, my guess is that you have several Bibles in your house, and most people have at least 2 different translations and maybe more. And we just take them for granted. But how often do those Bibles sit on the shelf? Or they sit in a prominent place in their good decoration, but we don't take the time to go and read them and study them? How often do we take time to gather as God's people and to study God's Word, to discuss with one another and to look and to be moved by what we hear and how we hear God speaking to others? How often do we take time to just stop in the day and spend time with God in God's presence and pray to God and also listen to God. A couple of weeks ago when I was out on vacation, Jenny Nolan talked beautifully about the importance of spending that time with God in silence, that time of God in stillness. And if you weren't here, or even if you were, it's worth going and listening to that sermon. You can find it because we post religious things all the time too on the Facebook page or on our church website. We can listen to sermons going back to January. And I'd encourage you to go and listen to Jenny's as she talks about that in a very powerful way. How often do we take time to specifically pray for others? We lift up names on the prayer list, and it's a wonderful thing to do. And the youth choir that came a few weeks ago, one of the things that she mentioned to me in the email when she wrote it and thanked us for allowing them to come, she said, I just thought that prayer time was very meaningful, that you still take time to call people out by name. How often do we take time to pause and simply say thank you to God? And to recognize and maybe try to name those countless blessings. How often do we recognize the simple power of those two words? How often are we instead filled with ingratitude? And we tend to focus more on the negative things and complain about the negative things that are going on. I saw a great quote by a friend of mine the other day, and she said, and I don't know if she came up with it or she found it somewhere, but it said, I am less human when I have anger in my heart. And that one really struck me. I'm less human when I have anger in my heart. And I would kind of expand on that a bit and say that I am less human when I have ingratitude in my heart. And I'm more human and I become more the person God has created me to be when I take that time to pause and to say thank you. You see, all of those times that we have that we spend with God, whether it's in our private personal time or whether it's gathered in worship or Sunday school, Bible studies, other gatherings that we have in God's name, if we gather in God's name and we really invest that time and we seek God's presence and we recognize God's presence, we can't help but live lives of gratitude. Lives that lead us to have more of God's mindset and less of the world's mindset. That time spent with God, either corporately or individually, leads us to have that passion for God and leads us to want to express that passion in our everyday interactions with others. And understand, when I'm talking about that passion and that energy that comes from the very core of our being, I'm not talking about it necessarily having to be in a way that is loud or boisterous or out there, not something where you find a way to turn every discussion into a religious discussion, not being loud or about it, not being abrasive or offensive about it. In fact, one of the things that we noticed and that impacted us about Teresa was that she was pretty quiet. But when we started talking with her and started learning more about her, and she had the opportunity to tell about what God was doing in her life, she jumped on it in a heartbeat. And in a very quiet and soft way, it had a tremendous impact on us. That passion showed through. I've known people who were very quiet, and I've known people who were very loud and theatrical and dramatic and just about everywhere all the time. And each of them had that passion in their hearts. They had their own way that fit with who they were of expressing and living out that faith in Jesus Christ. But the commonality was that deep abiding faith in the very core of their being, that joy that they had in their heart, that fervent, unending desire to serve God and to tell others about God's love. And I'm convinced beyond the shadow of a doubt that if we had more of that type of passion, if we demonstrated that, if we lived that out, most of the discussions that take place within churches, discussions about how do we reach out to different generations, how do we reach out to people outside of the church, how do we staff or fund the ministries that we have, how do we find people to serve in these different areas, different disagreements that we have along the way, most of them pettier than substantive, and all those types of things. If we lived out and had that fervent desire and passion and demonstrated that, most of those discussions would go away, or at the very least would take a very different turn. Because we would be filled so much with that joy of Jesus Christ. We would be filled with such gratitude that we would seek opportunities to be able to share that with others. People are attracted and they're moved by the passion that they see in others. And that passion is contagious. And it was one of the things that we noticed and we talked about with this simple example of Teresa and the impact she had on these pastors who had gone several thousand miles for a time of renewal of our own passion and renewal of our own spiritual energy for Jesus Christ. And a quick kind of little side note, one of the things that people say sometimes is, well, but that person's new in their faith, everything's new, they're learning all those different things. Of course she's going to be a little more excited. Of course she's going to be a little more joyful. Of course she's going to be a little more expressive about it. But I thought about that, and I've heard that pushback at different times from people. And I thought about that over the course of time. And one of the conclusions I came to is that if we are those people who accepted Jesus Christ maybe decades ago, and we have lived with that, and we have lived in that faith throughout our lives, and like me that grew up in the church and doesn't know what it's like not to go to church or Sunday school, then for those of us that have had that history over the course of decades, the joy and the passion and the desire ought to be greater, not less, because we have had these decades of experience to be able to see how God has worked in our lives. Teresa's just learning that, and she's excited about it. And those of us that have had decades, we ought to be more excited even than her, because we know. We don't have to doubt. We don't have to wonder if God's going to be there for us. We know God's going to do that. We don't have to wonder whether God's going to continue to bless us. We've seen that. We don't have to wonder whether or not God's going to use us in a powerful way. We've seen God do that already. We've seen that in others, and we saw how it attracted us to them and made us want to learn more and made us want to know God's love greater. And my prayer is that others would see that in us. One of my favorite books that I've ever read is by a guy named Donald Miller. And he wrote a book several years ago called Blue Like Jazz. And in that book, he talks about, and he says at the beginning, one of the early stories that he talks about his journey of faith, the ups and downs of it. And one of the things he says in there, he says, when I was a young man, I didn't like jazz. It just didn't make sense to me. Nothing ever seemed to really kind of fit together. It seemed a little too chaotic for me. I didn't really like it. He said, but one night I was walking down a street and there was the door to a restaurant open. And there was a guy in there playing live music, and he was in there playing his saxophone. And as I peered in the door, his eyes were closed and he was playing, and it was clear he was just in another place, just in another plane. And there was just this look of utter peace on his face. And he said, I sat there and watched him for many, many minutes, and he never opened his eyes, and his expression, that expression of peace and that expression of joy never changed. And he says, after that, I liked jazz. And he finishes this story with these words. He said, sometimes you have to watch somebody love something before you can learn to love it yourself. Sometimes you have to watch somebody love something before you can learn to love it yourself. Teresa reminded me of that story because in watching her, we were reminded of that deep wellspring of joy and passion that we have and are called to have. If somebody watched us, like Donald Miller watched that guy playing jazz that night, if somebody watched us loving Jesus, would they then love Jesus in return? Or do they think, well, this Jesus must not mean a whole lot, because it doesn't seem to mean a whole lot to them? as I mentioned last week, and I'll mention probably every week in this sermon series, the sights and the places that we went to in Spain were magnificent and wonderful and grand, and the architecture and the sheer engineering of it were pretty awe-inspiring. But what was even more grand and awe-inspiring was to see and the witness of people like Teresa, and to wonder if somehow, maybe in our abundance and in our tremendous blessing, if we haven't lost some of that passion for Jesus Christ. Oh, that we would have that type of simple joy, that we would remember on a daily basis to say thank you, to say thank you first and foremost to God for what God has done and continues to do, to say thank you to those people in our lives who have touched us and impacted us, that we might have that joy and that excitement and that passion and that fervent desire to serve God daily, that others might observe us loving Jesus and they in turn learn to love Jesus because they see how much He loves us and how much we love Him. My challenge and my encouragement to you in the weeks ahead, is if you feel like you have lost some of that passion and that joy, to find those ways to rediscover it. Do as Dean talked about, the guy in the book, to say thank you to God and say thank you to others. To recognize the blessings of life and give thanks to God for them. To spend that time in silence and stillness with God. But not only just do that individually, to spend that time together in times of worship and study, in times of prayer with one another. To commit to pray for one another so that we know that we are praying for others by name and we are being prayed for by name. That we might live those lives that would impact and would attract others to Jesus Christ as well. Our closing hymn is hymn number 171. There's something about that name. We're going to sing it through. We're going to plan to sing it through just one time. But what I want to do is I want to offer you a time, if you feel led to do so, to come down to the rail and kneel in prayer. You can do that where you are. You can do it when you go home, and I hope that you will. God hears our prayers, whether it's here or whether we are seated where we are. But to offer that prayer of thanksgiving to God, to thank God for His blessings, and to think about maybe one person, even if it's just one person, that you can say thank you to. And one person that you can reach out that will see that passion and that joy of God manifest in your life, that'll make them want to come and learn more about Jesus. If people are still here praying, when we get to the end of the first verse, we'll just sing it again. So if you feel led to come and we're getting ready to conclude the first verse, just come on. We'll sing it through again. Let us stand together as we sing, Jesus, Jesus, there's just something about that name.